January 17, 1945. The air is thick with the scent of smoke and damp earth. In the distant jungle, the rhythmic pulse of drums echoes in the silence of the Pacific Islands. A faint breeze stirs the leaves, carrying with it the muffled sounds of soldiers marching in formation. On a small makeshift camp in a far corner of the war zone, a group of Japanese female prisoners, young, worn, and anxious, waits for their next command. Their minds, overwhelmed by fear, are consumed with thoughts of what horrors the American forces might have in store for them. Their entire lives, shaped by the oppressive expectations of their own military and society, had prepared them for brutality, not mercy. But as the Americans approach, a strange quiet fills the air. No harsh commands, no glaring threats. Instead, they're greeted with something they hadn't expected: respect, equality, an experience that will leave them forever changed, unable to reconcile the horrors of war with the compassion they now encounter. What they thought would be a moment of humiliation becomes unexpectedly a moment of humanity. The realization stirs something deeper, a belief in the possibility of decency amid chaos, even among sworn enemies. World War II had already altered the global landscape, and by early 1945, the Allied forces, led by the United States, had turned the tide against the Axis powers. While the conflict was primarily defined by large-scale battles and military strategy, the human stories, the soldiers, civilians, and prisoners caught in the chaos, were often overlooked. For women, especially in the Japanese Empire, war brought not only physical destruction, but also a radical shift in their traditional roles. Historically, Japanese women were largely seen through the lens of submission and duty, supporting the war effort from the home front, often as nurses or factory workers. The idea of women as warriors was unthinkable in pre-war Japan, but as the war escalated, some women were drawn into active combat roles, serving as auxiliary soldiers or spies. For them, the war was not just a physical battle, but a battle against their own cultural limitations. When captured by the American forces, these women found themselves in an unimaginable position. A prisoner, yes, but also a woman caught between two very different worlds. The Japanese military, known for its harsh treatment of both its soldiers and prisoners, had long reinforced strict hierarchical structures. Prisoners of war, especially women, were often seen as nothing more than tools for intelligence gathering or bargaining chips in diplomatic exchanges. The American military, however, had a different approach. After the battles on Pacific islands like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, American soldiers began to rethink their policies regarding prisoners, especially as their experiences with female POWs started to shape their perceptions. At the time, there was a strict, militaristic ethos within the Japanese Imperial Army that shaped how female prisoners were treated. American soldiers, influenced by a mixture of traditional chivalric codes and post-Victorian ideals of humanity, were increasingly determined to treat prisoners in a manner that was, at the very least, consistent with the Geneva Conventions. But the question remained: could the deeply ingrained prejudices of war be cast aside for a moment of humanity? Could these female prisoners, who had fought for a system that saw them as expendable, be treated with respect as equals? The treatment of prisoners in wartime is often dictated by the cultures and ideologies of the captors, but by 1945, there was a growing shift in how the U.S. military viewed enemy prisoners, particularly women. The principles set forth in the Geneva Conventions of 1929, which outlined the humane treatment of POWs, were not always strictly followed by all nations during the war. Still, they offered a foundation for American forces to build a more ethical approach, even in the heat of brutal conflict. For female prisoners, the situation was even more complicated. Unlike their male counterparts, who were often subjected to grueling labor camps, starvation, and harsh interrogations, women in wartime were frequently treated as second-class prisoners, seen through the lens of gender roles. In Japanese-controlled territories, women often faced extreme mistreatment and were forced into military brothels, where they were exploited as comfort women for soldiers. Many of these women had seen nothing but brutality, and the idea that they might receive anything approaching equal treatment from their American captors was unfathomable. But as the American forces began capturing Japanese soldiers and their auxiliaries, a surprising approach began to emerge, especially among the women prisoners. With little to no guidance on how to handle female POWs, the American soldiers often relied on their own moral compass, rather than direct military protocols. They began treating their female prisoners with a level of respect and consideration that was a stark contrast to the dehumanization those women had experienced under Japanese rule. The POWs were given food, shelter, and clothing in accordance with the standards of the Geneva Conventions, something few had anticipated. This was not an act of charity, but rather a strategic move by American military leadership to maintain morale and sow seeds of loyalty among those they had captured. At the time, there was a broader effort within the U.S. military to maintain a clear ethical stance against the Japanese forces, who were known for their brutal treatment of prisoners. The concept of treating all prisoners, regardless of their gender or race, with some level of dignity had a tactical edge. American soldiers understood that showing respect could weaken the psychological resolve of their captives, demoralizing them without the need for physical force. For the Japanese women who found themselves captured by American forces, the reality of their situation was jarring. Raised in a society that revered the idea of honor and sacrifice, many of these women had fought for the war effort, believing in the righteousness of their country's cause. They had been told by their military leaders that the enemies they fought were ruthless, less human, and undeserving of respect. But now, in the hands of the very forces they were trained to despise, their world was upended. The American soldiers' treatment of them was almost unfathomable. There were no harsh commands, no forced labor or mistreatment. Instead, the prisoners were provided with adequate food, clean bedding, and were even allowed some freedoms. This seemingly simple act of kindness was not just a logistical decision, it was an emotional shock. These women, accustomed to brutality, were faced with the reality that their captors saw them as human beings. In the absence of violence, the psychological toll was immense. It forced them to question everything they had been taught. The sense of betrayal was palpable. Many of the women had lived through years of indoctrination, believing the Americans were nothing more than savage enemies. Now they faced the uncomfortable truth that their captors were treating them with a form of equality they had never experienced before. This newfound respect, though genuine, created a rift in their understanding of the world. It was hard to process. Were these Americans truly different, or was this a strategy? And if they were truly different, what did that say about the war they had been fighting? For many of these women, the experience would be one of disillusionment. They had been taught to view their enemies through a lens of hatred, but the reality of their captivity shattered that worldview. They now had to reconcile the kindness they received with their deeply held beliefs about their captors. The decision by American military leadership to treat female Japanese prisoners with respect had far-reaching tactical implications, especially in terms of psychological warfare. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, the U.S. military had been engaged in brutal combat, often using overwhelming force to achieve strategic objectives. However, there was a growing recognition that the war was not just about physical dominance. It was also about breaking the enemy's will to fight. American military leaders understood that how they treated prisoners could significantly impact the psychological resilience of both the captives and the broader enemy population. The treatment of Japanese female prisoners, in particular, was seen as an opportunity to demonstrate American values of fairness, compassion, and strength. By treating these women with dignity, the Americans were making a powerful statement. Even in war, they could maintain a moral high ground. On a tactical level, this treatment served to undermine the rigid militaristic culture of Imperial Japan, where soldiers and civilians were conditioned to obey without question, and where the concept of personal dignity often didn't extend to women, let alone prisoners. The act of offering respect to female captives demonstrated the U.S. military's cultural superiority in a way that could not be easily refuted. It became an implicit form of psychological warfare. The respect shown to Japanese women under American captivity contrasted sharply with the brutal treatment many had suffered under their own military's rule. This approach also reflected the American understanding that their treatment of prisoners had broader diplomatic consequences. In post-war Japan, where rebuilding and reconciling would be key, these actions provided a foundation for future U.S.-Japan relations. By demonstrating that Americans could treat prisoners of war, including women, with respect, The military set the stage for a more nuanced relationship with Japan after the war's end. This tactical move also had an internal benefit. It reinforced the moral integrity of the American military, improving the soldiers' sense of pride and fostering unity within their ranks. They were not simply fighting for victory, they were fighting for the preservation of a moral code, even amidst the violence of war. The turning point came quietly, almost imperceptibly, amid the chaos of the war. January 17, 1945, a crisp morning on one of the Pacific Islands. For weeks, the American forces had been holding Japanese female prisoners captured during the recent island skirmishes. The women, many of whom had been part of support units or had served in auxiliary roles, had been conditioned to view their captors as subhuman. The brutality of the Japanese military had taught them to expect the same from their enemies. They had braced themselves for the worst, but instead of the expected punishment, they were treated with an unexpected humanity. They were provided with food, water, and medical care. They were housed in conditions that, though basic, were far from the squalid, overcrowded environments they had anticipated. When they were spoken to, it was with an unfamiliar courtesy. For many, it was the first time in their lives they had been treated like equals rather than subordinates. As the days passed, a shift occurred among the women. At first, disbelief took root. Was this some kind of psychological tactic? A ruse to break their spirits before they were subjected to worse conditions? But as the weeks wore on and the treatment remained consistent, respectful, even kind, they began to wonder. Could it be real? Were these Americans truly different from the enemy they had been taught to fear and despise? The realization came slowly but unmistakably. There was no trick. They were not being treated as prisoners in the traditional sense. They were not mere pawns in a strategic game, nor were they being used to extract intelligence. They were, for the first time, treated as human beings with dignity and fairness. For women who had spent their entire lives subjugated under a rigid and oppressive system, this was a profound shock, a moment that would fundamentally alter their perception of both war and their captors. This moment of clarity was not just a realization of physical treatment, but an emotional revelation. It forced the women to confront the profound contradictions between the values they had been raised to uphold and the harsh realities of their wartime experience. They now faced a moral conundrum. Could they reconcile their cultural upbringing with the kindness they were now receiving? And if the Americans were treating them with respect, what did that say about the war they had been fighting? As the realization set in, the emotional weight of their captivity grew heavier for the Japanese female prisoners. They had been conditioned for war, for suffering, for the belief that the enemy was less than human. But the American forces had shattered that perception by offering them respect and humane treatment, something they hadn't anticipated from those they had been taught to hate. The aftermath of this shift was profound. The women were not the only ones who were changed. The American soldiers, too, were affected. The initial shock of treating the enemy with dignity created a moment of introspection. These soldiers, many of whom had been exposed to the brutal realities of the Pacific theater, found themselves facing their own moral boundaries. Could they, as combatants, still hold on to the values of respect and decency in the face of all the death and destruction surrounding them? The American command's decision to treat the prisoners humanely, especially the women, had ripple effects beyond the prisoners' immediate experience. When the prisoners were finally released or repatriated, many returned to Japan with a story unlike any other. They spoke of the Americans not as ruthless enemies, but as captors who treated them as equals, a striking contrast to the narrative of dehumanization they had been fed during the war. For some, the emotional impact was long-lasting. Many Japanese women who had been prisoners during the war could not fully reconcile the kindness they had received from their American captors with their previous convictions. Their loyalty to Japan, once unshakable, began to falter in the face of the compassion they had encountered. They were left to grapple with the stark reality that their perception of the war and of their place within it had been distorted by propaganda and blind nationalism. Meanwhile, the American military had unwittingly crafted a new psychological weapon. The treatment of these women, which seemed like a matter of ethics at first, became a tool for undermining the Japanese will to fight. As news of the humane treatment spread, it reinforced the narrative of American morality, contrasting it with the perceived barbarity of the Japanese regime. This became a critical psychological advantage, demonstrating that the Americans had not only the power to defeat Japan, but the moral authority to rebuild and reshape the post-war world. The aftermath of the humane treatment of Japanese female prisoners marked a profound shift in both military strategy and post-war diplomacy. For the American forces, this act of respect was not just a moral decision, it became a cornerstone of the psychological warfare campaign. The power of this gesture echoed far beyond the battlefields of the Pacific. It left a lasting imprint on the minds of the prisoners and, by extension, on Japan's post-war reconstruction. When the women returned to Japan after the war, their accounts of being treated as equals by their American captors became a topic of intense discussion. These women were not just witnesses to the war, they became conduits of a new narrative about their enemies. The stories they shared contradicted the long-held belief in Japan that the Americans were brutal, savage invaders. Instead, they spoke of a surprising degree of dignity, kindness, and respect from the very forces their country had condemned. This narrative shift contributed to a broader reevaluation of the relationship between Japan and the United States in the years that followed. For Japan, the aftermath was just as significant. The realization that their own women had been treated humanely by American soldiers shattered the wartime narrative of American barbarism. It forced the Japanese government, as well as its citizens, to confront uncomfortable truths about the cruelty of their own military system and its treatment of both civilians and prisoners. As Japan moved into its post-war period of occupation and eventual reconstruction, the image of the enemy began to soften. The American occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, worked to establish democratic institutions and redefine the relationship between the two nations. The human treatment of Japanese prisoners played a subtle but crucial role in that transformation. The psychological toll on the women themselves was equally significant. Many of the female prisoners returned to Japan disillusioned, not just with their captors but with the ideology they had fought for. They had been taught that their sacrifice was for the glory of the empire, that their struggle was noble. Yet the kindness they received from their American captors left them with a feeling of betrayal. For some, it marked the end of their belief in the imperial system and the beginning of a new, more complex understanding of humanity and war. The psychological impact of this event extended far beyond the immediate prisoners and soldiers involved. The treatment of Japanese female POWs by the American forces marked a pivotal moment in the history of psychological warfare. It wasn't just about victory on the battlefield. It was about the way the Americans were able to manipulate the psychological landscape of their enemy without firing a shot. The realization that their enemies, the American soldiers, could treat them as equals was not easily accepted by all of the prisoners. Many, having been steeped in the ideology of the Japanese Empire, initially saw it as an anomaly, a temporary kindness that could not be trusted. However, as time wore on, the reality of their treatment sunk in. The psychological dissonance they experienced was not unlike that felt by soldiers on both sides of the war, who were forced to reckon with the morality of their actions. For the Japanese military leadership, the shift in perception was uncomfortable, if not devastating. The propaganda machine had long been at work in Japan, painting the United States as a ruthless, barbaric force that sought to destroy the honor and spirit of the Japanese people. But as the stories of humane treatment spread among the POWs, these ideals began to crack. The idea that their enemies could treat them with respect even as prisoners of war was a blow to the propaganda narrative they had relied on to justify the war effort. The American soldiers, who had been encouraged to treat all prisoners humanely, also grappled with the psychological weight of their actions. For many, this moment became an ethical benchmark. The treatment of Japanese female prisoners provided a sharp contrast to the brutality they had witnessed and participated in on the front lines. In the Pacific Theater, atrocities were committed on both sides, but the act of extending dignity to their captives was a quiet act of defiance against the barbarism of war. The soldiers who practiced this humane treatment were not just following orders, they were creating a moral legacy that would resonate long after the war had ended. This shift in psychological tactics did not stop with the prisoners or the soldiers. it extended to the world beyond the war. As the post-war era unfolded, the American public would come to view the treatment of prisoners as one of the defining characteristics of American military conduct during World War II. It stood in stark contrast to the atrocities committed by the Axis powers and laid the foundation for the development of international humanitarian law and the principles that would guide future conflicts. The story of how Japanese female prisoners were treated by American forces during World War II offers a profound reflection on the complexities of war, morality, and humanity. In a conflict defined by brutality, the simple act of respecting the dignity of one's enemy stands as a stark reminder that even in the darkest times, the choice for compassion and respect remains possible. This moment of human decency, when enemies treated each other as equals, becomes a powerful lesson in the possibility of moral integrity, even in the face of overwhelming violence. In the broader scope of history, this episode speaks to the power of psychological warfare. It wasn't just the destruction of cities or the loss of soldiers that shaped the course of World War II. It was also the unseen battles, the emotional and moral shifts that occurred when combatants from opposing sides were forced to confront their shared humanity. For the women who were captured, it was an awakening, a realization that the ideals they had been raised on were not universally true, and that their own captors could hold values of compassion and equality. For the American soldiers, this moment not only changed their perceptions of the war, but also their understanding of themselves. They were not simply fighting for victory, they were fighting for something more, a deeper belief in the ethical principles of respect, humanity, and decency. In many ways, this quiet moment of kindness on a far-off Pacific island became one of the most important legacies of the war. Ultimately, this event highlights the capacity for change and growth in the most unlikely of circumstances. In the face of war's overwhelming violence, the ability to treat one's enemy as an equal was a profound act of resistance against the brutality of war, against the propaganda of hatred, and against the idea that war dehumanizes us all. It was a moment when humanity, however fragile, rose above the madness of the battlefield, reminding us that the highest moral ground is not always won through force, but through respect and understanding.